Hi, Alicia.
Hello.
I'm Jonathan Surovell. I'm speaking with Alicia Weigel. You won the vote that I hold every semester in my class. My students propose and vote on people for me to interview. The class is ethics and society, so I ask them to propose people working and thinking about issues of relevance to that. So congratulations on your victory.
Thank you. So how were the candidates proposed? Were they just articles you had come across or?
I give them complete freedom, really.
Oh,
Uh, so, Barack Obama also got a lot of votes.
wow.
Um, I try to steer things towards I try to steer them towards candidates who might be a little less busy than him or less more likely to agree to do this.
Right.
Yeah. Um, but so congrats. So on your website, you say that you're an intersex advocate and a progressive advocate. I think most of the questions that I'll be asking have more to do with the intersex side of things, but I, I guess there's probably an interconnection between those two sides of your work. So maybe the progressive side of your work will come out as well.
Yeah, absolutely. And I'm happy to talk about kind of how I came out and got into this work too, which kind of bridges both of them, if that's helpful.
It is. Maybe let's start with what intersex conditions are, what the intersex issues are, and then maybe it'd be nice to hear about what you're doing, how you got into it. So could we
Sure.
start from sort of the very beginning? What is an intersex condition?
So it's interesting because there are many intersex people who wouldn't even want me to call it conditions. They'd rather have me call them traits or because conditions, I think people tend to sound like we're medically kind of pathologizing our community. But to be intersex is up to 2% of the world's population. By the most recent estimates I've seen, around 1.7% of the world's population are born biologically between what's traditionally considered the binary biological sexes of male and female. So this is not to do with sexual preferences and orientation. It doesn't have to do with gender identity. It has to do with the physical conditions that we are born into, whether in terms of hormonal differences or chromosomal differences that basically lead to us being born intersex or between the sexes. So for me, what that meant is that I have XY chromosomes, which is traditionally considered to be male, biologically male. But I was born, that was kind of my genotype, but in terms of my phenotype and how I appear to the world, is much closer to what most people would consider to be female. I guess just a little background and history on that. My parents got into a car crash when they were pregnant with me, and they did an amniocentesis, which is like a needle that they stick into the womb for kind of diagnostic purposes to see if the baby was okay. And that amniocentesis told my parents that I had XY chromosomes, and so they chose all boys' names and they painted everything blue. They had like a blue nursery waiting at home and all this stuff. And then I was born with a vagina and looking female, and so they knew something was up. And there was the addition that my aunt, my mom's sister, was also born intersex, although her experience having grown up been born in the late 1940s was very, very different than mine. And so the way that she found out and all of this was totally different. And her whole experience as an intersex person has been different than mine. But because of the fact that they knew about my aunt and they knew that I had XY chromosomes, but that I was appearing phenotypically a certain way, the doctors were able to essentially diagnose me as having a condition called complete androgen insensitivity, which means that I did not respond to androgen hormones in the womb. And so while all fetuses or embryos, I'm not really a biological expert, but I'm not sure at which stage it is, but start off looking the same and then they eventually differentiate. And I basically kind of paused developing before reaching a certain point of differentiation because I didn't respond to certain hormones in the womb. And the way that I'm describing this is super medicalized, which is not what I would want to do, because what we're essentially, when you asked what intersex issues are and some of the issues that we're facing, I mean, they're manifold, honestly, all rooted in kind of stigma and shame. But one of the greatest ones is that there are normalizing surgeries enacted on our bodies, and there have been multiple justifications for these, and I can speak about a few of them, none as well as my own personal story. I can only speak on behalf of one intersex person, and that is myself. But these surgeries are done to basically fit us into one of two boxes. The doctors that I had when I was born made the choice to put female on my birth certificate, but now depending on which country you're born in, which city, which state you're born in, there are additional options beyond just male and female to put on birth certificates. Because what we're learning is that this large swath of the world's population are actually in between, and that we don't need to normalize children into these boxes that society is more comfortable with. Because either the wrong choice is made or a choice is made that the person undergoing that surgery has not had consent, has not been able to consent to because they're an infant or a young child. Or even if the surgery didn't necessarily contradict the person's preferred gender identity or inherent gender identity, then still the vast majority of these surgeries are medically unnecessary and purely cosmetic. And so basically by like the World Health Organization and Amnesty International, and all these kind of international Human Rights Watch, all these international human rights groups and organizations, there's just very little justification for doing it at a point before an individual is able to consent to what is happening on their bodies. So for me, that just meant that they removed my internal testes, which I was born with internal testes instead of a uterus and ovaries, as one might have expected looking at me from the outside. And for me, that has led to kind of hormonal imbalances and early menopause and some psychosocial effects. And then the isolation of never being able to talk about all of those things also led to a whole host of social emotional, a lot of social emotional distress growing up and into my young adulthood. But that was my experience, and that's just from having had an internal surgery being done. A lot of people that are born with externally ambiguous genitalia will have these surgeries done that might alter their gender identity. It might affect their sexual sensation and ability to have sex without pain. A lot of it is done under heteronormative ideals, or kind of Western ideals about what a body is look like or what sort of sex this person will want to have later in their life. And
Can I just ask real quick, could
Yeah.
you say what you mean by heteronormative ideals?
Yeah, so I mean, for me, again, the vast majority of the issues that I have dealt with are internal, but like externally, I had to use a dilator when I was a kid and early into puberty to basically have my vagina be of a length to be penetrable for penetrative sex. And those decisions were made by doctors when I was like 8 or 9 years old, that that's like what I would want. And so I should be using this dilator, which, if you can imagine, like a kid of that age, like doing that and preparing themselves for sex and puberty, it was a whole crazy thing to deal with mentally, and just very isolating, because it's certainly not anything that any of my friends had to deal with. So that's kind of how that applied to me. Also, I remember doctors talking about what my ideal breast size should be. So when they removed my testes, they removed my hormone producing organs, and then only replaced me with feminizing hormones. So my testes would have produced testosterone, and like 99% of the world's population has testosterone. But because they had made that decision that I was supposed to be a girl, they never, in my hormone replacement therapy, testosterone was never included. It was only estrogen and progesterone, which means that my hormonal balance has never been what it would have been in my body and what my body was born for. It was kind of this like forced balance that, it definitely affects mood, and the different levels that have been used can affect bone density, which can lead to osteoporosis later in life. So there are all of these other physical effects. But then there's also just been pieces like, for example, for a majority of my life, I was just taking birth control because they're like, oh, you need estrogen and progesterone, and that's in birth control, so you can take this. But then I started realizing, well, why am I taking the placebo week? Because the way most birth control pills work, or contraceptive pills work, is you take 3 weeks and then you get a week of placebo pills so that you get your period. But I was like, I don't have a uterus and ovaries, so why am I going a month without hormones each month and putting my body through that week of just no hormones, when there's like no reason for me to be doing that? And the doctors were like, oh yeah, that makes sense. But that's just kind of part of the plight of an intersex person, is because we've all been normalized into one of two categories that our body is truly neither. When we were born in between. And by forcing us into one of those two categories, then all the medicine that we receive, or all the care that we receive, is through that pillar that we have been like shoved into. And it's not considering actually like how our bodies would function best, or what is best for like our health and well-being. It's all considered through this lens of like, so I mentioned the heteronormative piece, but also just kind of the binary, the gender binary that is proposed through like Christianity, for example, or like through Christian religion. So reading the Bible, everything is so binary. Like it was black, it was white, it was good, it was bad, it was man, it was woman. And really, we know like the world doesn't exist just in those terms. And from a gender perspective, native cultures in the US had 4 genders versus 2, and 2 spirit genders. And when you look at Hinduism, those lines get blurred, or Kabbalah Judaism, or a lot of other kind of religions and philosophies around the world. But for intersex people, because Western medicine is so prevalent throughout the world, and Western medicine is like informed by Western philosophy and doctrine, like our bodies and our emotional and psychological health has suffered on account of being unnecessarily forced into these 2 rigid boxes that are not truly as binary and immutable as society wants us to believe.
Yeah, you mentioned heteronormativity and sort of a sex binary view. Do you think there's also a kind of view of normalcy involved here, where there's sort of a leap from what's typical in the population, right? That a large percentage are a certain way, to that's the normal way to be, that's the best way to be.
Yeah.
In one of your pieces, you mentioned let me see if I can pronounce this right. Clitoroplasty?
Yes.
Clitoroplasty?
Neuroplasty, yeah.
So, you talked about a doctor at Cornell, a surgeon, performing this operation. So this is I'm no expert on this. I did a little bit of research, just kind of following up on your article.
Yeah.
So as I understand it, this is an operation that shortens sort of atypically long clitorises.
Yeah.
So
if you even think about it, so there are these doctors that, yeah, they'll basically like cut down little intersex kids' clitorises to make them within a realm of what they consider to be normal. But if you think about that, like they have like a clitorogram, like a measure of what they consider to be normal. So if you're like, they're making an arbitrary decision of like where normal begins and atypical begins. And if you're longer than that, then they're gonna cut this piece off of you and then test with vibrators to see how much sensation you still feel. And yeah, I mean it's pretty disgusting. This this same doctor that performs those, like, I don't know if you can see this in the camera, but this is him sitting with one of his patients on his lap and kissing his face. So yeah, this guy just needs to have his medical license stripped of him, but I don't really have time for that right now, but yeah.
Yeah. And just one last point about clitoroplasty. So I saw your discussion of it in your article, and I looked it up, and I was sort of thinking maybe this is her side of the issue, and I'm gonna, let me get the other side. Is a licensed doctor really doing something so extreme? So what I found, I read like the journal Pediatrics had a big committee, an article written by a huge committee of pediatricians on this. This was in 2000. They talked about sort of the benefits, how to do the operation the best way, what works best. They never addressed the question of what the benefits of the surgery are, except to say, without citing any research, to just say the goal is to get a normal looking clitoris and have a normal sex life. It was the same thing, and I read a meta-analysis. It was the let's see, the lead author was Sotiropoulos. And the meta-analysis, the main conclusion of it was we actually don't understand female physiology as well as we thought we did, and this is a problem for clitoroplasty. And then the one article cited that was supposed to be about the benefits of clitoroplasty didn't study the benefits of clitoroplasty at all. It was just about which operations have the fewest side effects.
Exactly.
So
yeah, and
anyway,
for sure,
that sort of opened my eyes a little bit. Seeing where the medical community on this issue, there's a huge gap in their thinking about this operation.
Well, and what you're talking about brings up a broader point, which is that because of these early interventions that are made to fit us into these categories or normal ranges, there's such a dearth of research on what we would end up being like, feeling like, psychologically, socially, emotionally, if we were just left alone. And there's such a dearth of that research out there. A lot of people who are intersex might not even know that they're intersex, because depending on like how you're born, I mean, if I hadn't had the amniocentesis, I wouldn't have known that I was intersex until I didn't get a period. And then they would have found out. And so then they would have decided about my medical interventions, probably in my late teens versus as an infant, which they knew with me, which would have made my childhood entirely different. And I would have had a lot less to unpack. But what I'm finding now, and what so many intersex people, we have to advocate for our own healthcare and well-being, because there's just such a lack of definitive medical information out there. And I think that so much of that is because the interventions are done so early that then they can't even they can't even accurately like measure what are the effects of these outcomes, right? Like, or what would be the effects of not intervening. So that's why, I mean, I'm very grateful for the parents now that are deciding not to intervene, and so that we have more information out there. Then there comes into play the whole question about, like, from a medical ethics standpoint, about experimenting on children, and at what age should they be participating in what sorts of studies, and consent in that realm. Um, but you know, it's just crazy for me to think about that. Like, if my mom had not been in that car crash, then I never would have had to see all these doctors my whole life as a kid who were telling me that I was abnormal, and so I should never tell anyone because I would not be lovable, and that I would not find love unless, you know, I acted a certain way and fit in with the other girls and whatever, and so that I shouldn't talk to people. And I wouldn't have had to go under anesthesia at random points for, you know, for medical research purposes, which is really traumatic as a kid. Like, I just have these vague memories of not really understanding why I was in the hospital or why I was going under anesthesia. But, and then there's the whole separate piece about the effects of anesthesia on children's brains at certain ages, which is a separate piece. Um, but you know, all of these things that I had to go through as a kid, like, and lying to everyone, and feeling unlovable, and going under anesthesia and being in the hospital all the time and using these dilators and doing all these things, I never would have had to do any of that if my mom had not been in the car crash. Like, I just would have discovered, like, I would have never gotten a period. I don't know at what age the doctor would have figured that out and been like, oh, there's something going on here. But like, my life and my personality and my whole existence, like, would be totally different. And also the fact that they removed my testes and then pumped me with estrogen and progesterone as a kid, like, I don't even know what I would look like without these decisions that were made for me. So it's just this crazy piece of like, how it's everyone else's decision except for ours, and it's up to the individual doctors, because there's no good standard of care, and one doctor might use a clitorogram to see whatever. Like, whose job is it to determine what's normal, and whose job is it to, and who determines body autonomy and self-determination? And anyway.
That's exactly what I wanted to get into. So, okay, let me try this. This is a big question. Just if I may take a minute to set this up.
Yeah.
So if we think about something, let's think of a condition like, I know the word condition's kind of controversial, but think about ADHD, which makes life difficult for people who have it. Why is ADHD, why do we consider that a disorder? Well, it probably has something to do with the society we live in. ADHD, I doubt it would have been a problem in hunter-gatherer societies. I don't know for sure. I guess I'm kind of speculating, but for a lot of conditions, it seems like, for a lot of things we consider disordered, requiring medical or psychiatric intervention, it's a problem within a social context. And sometimes that's legitimate. Like, our social context is such that maybe we should try to alleviate ADHD. Of course, we want to do stuff that works, but and that doesn't have, where the side effects aren't worse than the original condition. On the other hand, you can you can misuse that idea of the social context mattering, and so homosexuality was considered a mental disorder.
Exactly.
A few decades ago, dissidents in the Soviet Union were classified as having a psychological disorder. So I guess I'm wondering, like, could there be some intersex conditions where, like in your case, it seems to me that changing somebody's like the physiology of their hormones, that's just such a delicate system to be tinkering with. Like I wouldn't want to try to kind of reproduce the right hormone balance synthetically and remove somebody's organs like that. But are there other, could there be other, or are there other intersex conditions where they might make it harder to flourish in our social setting? And
Because
so,
they're externally visible or
yeah, and so could some of them be more like ADHD, where like it is true that it's because of our social environment that they're a problem, just like it's the same thing for ADHD. But you know, the operation, the side effect isn't so significant as it is in your case. Could it be worth parents making that choice for their children in some of those? Are there any cases like that where it
yeah, I
might be
guess
okay
that's
for
like some of the argument that the parents make is like at a swimming pool, if their kids' genitalia are, you know, different than what's considered normal and the kid gets made fun of. And I think that if that happens, and then we determine based on like legal precedent, based on psychological input from the psychological community, like what is an age of consent to be able to make those sorts of decisions, which would affect trans kids as well, and so many things, then I think a kid has a right to determine for themselves. But I think what is lacking right now is the parents have determined that psychological trauma is so much worse than the psychological trauma of having had your body manipulated and to be told that you are unlovable and you're a problem and that you should hide who you are your whole life. Like there's somehow been, and I've seen no definitive research as to like really truly support this, that the decision has always been based on the parents thinking, oh, it would be so much worse for them to be seen as abnormal or outside of the norm, that's going to be so much worse than if we just intervene. When honestly, all I can say is, and just from my own experience, like it's so, you still have so much of a negative social side effect. Like the issue is not our bodies, the issue is the societal stigma. And so our tool should not be a scalpel. Our tool should be educating our kids about how to be more accepting of differences, and you know, and teaching people to be proud of who they are and their bodies, and just teaching about the diversity of life as it exists. And I think that's what we've seen happen now. You mentioned with homosexuality being considered originally like a psychological condition, now banning conversion therapy, because we're seeing that there are, for example, okay, so there are higher rates of HIV transmission in the men who have sex with men community. But that doesn't mean that because you're gay, you're going to get AIDS. Or it doesn't mean that because AIDS is a risk, we should completely like psychologically manipulate kids so that they're not gay, which doesn't work anyway, as we know. But anyway, it's the same thing. It's like, okay, so there's this risk that because intersex kids have different genitalia, that they might be made fun of, they might not find a husband or a partner that accepts them as who they are, and that will be a hard experience for them. But we need to understand that like it's the same thing where there's also a risk. I know intersex people that have partners and they do find people that love them. And there are so many intersex people, I would say the vast majority of intersex people, rather than their families, rather than doctors, will tell you that we do not want these interventions done on us, and that we're proud of who we are, and that it's not a pathology, it's our identity. And I think that just another example beyond homosexuality, it's like if we're thinking more from a medical perspective, little girls that have the BRCA gene, for example, where they might be predisposed to having breast cancer or uterine cancer when they're older, we're not proactively removing their ovaries and sterilizing them as children. The only reason that the medical community is doing this is because my body is not considered normal. Otherwise, they would also be removing breasts and ovaries from little girls born with the BRCA gene in this age of like genetic testing and 23andMe and everyone knowing, you know, far in advance, like what sorts of conditions their child might be born with or whatever. So I think whether you're looking at it from that standpoint, or homosexuality, it's like we just need to, if we can just get society to catch up to speed and say what is normal, there is no normal. It's completely dependent on which society we're born into, which context we're looking at, and that any intervention to normalize someone in any context should be made by that person whose body, whose mind, whose personhood is in question. Then I don't know, and then we don't have true self-determination, and we don't have true body autonomy. And I think the ADD question is a really legitimate one. And I saw a movie about that recently by who was it? What's that? Oh, Maria Shriver just came up with some documentary where she talks about just that. And it's a really good question. And I don't know how to speak on behalf of that community. I know that circumcision is a really interesting analogy as well. And should we be doing that? Because that affects children's ability to feel pleasure, or adults' ability to feel pleasure based on circumcision decisions while they were children. I do think that that's a very different conversation because, well, I mean, so the overlap is that people would say like uncircumcised kids would be made fun of, and so that's why we should circumcise them. I do think that that is purely taking into account the intersex, like the psychological standpoint of like, oh, they'll be made fun of, and not taking into account like hormone balances and all these other pieces. But yeah, I mean, it's all part of the same discussion. It's like, who's to determine what is normal? Who's to determine that the risk of being made fun of or ostracized is the greater problem that we need to fix than just like society ostracizing these people?
Yeah. And I think I agree that balancing the risks is an important part of the decision. I wonder if there's also another part of it that's sort of independent of that, where some decision might seem sort of unjust and like a concession to injustice or a concession to oppression. And it's these things are so hard, you know, these decisions are so hard. I'm as we just discussed, and as my students know, I'm a new parent, and you know, there are some issues where like doing what's best for my kid might involve going along with some unjust structures or something. And it's really hard to choose to fight for justice and kind of maybe have slightly worse outcomes for my daughter. Like that's so I mean,
Yeah.
I'm not my point isn't that that's the decision that those are the considerations facing parents of intersex babies, but just to point out there are two issues here.
And I think one of the biggest things that I've overcome with my own mother is that, like, I don't blame my mom. I know why she did what she did. Like, she did it because she was told by these medical communities that I would grow up being ostracized and shamed, and I would not find love, and I would not find happiness, and all these things. But like, I'm proving her wrong. Like, I've come out now, and I am like thriving. It's like, as soon as I came out, like, I'm now in appointed office in the city of Austin. I founded my own company. I'm making a lot of money. I bought my own condo. Like, I'm thriving as an out and open intersex person. And I think if we give people the chance, we've always done things one way, right? Why don't we do things for the other way for a minute and see what happens when we don't intervene? Because we've never given kids that chance, or not as far as in the history of the world as we understand it. But in societies where they have let intersex people alone and left them alone, as far as I've seen in like all these books, like certain societies like revered intersex people as like transcending these like earthly boxes or bodies or whatever that are considered traditional, and so they were viewed more as like being closer to the divine, of having aspects of both and having perspectives of both. And I don't know, I mean, there's been just this societal conception that kids will be made fun of, and you know, I bet like a lot of kids would be made fun of, but I don't think that that is enough justification to do these surgeries as we are now. And I would just challenge these doctors and challenge these parents to say, why don't we try it the other way and see what happens?
Good. Yeah, that brings us to a student question. You've just so the students watching know, I think you've covered a bunch of their questions actually, about how the surgery affected you. There's a good question about the lack of consent of intersex people to these, you know, to these operations that happen before they're of the age to consent. But one student was wondering, are you in favor of illegalizing, prohibiting these kinds of operations, maybe for certain ages?
Yeah.
And are you optimistic that that's going to happen anytime soon?
Good question. I have a kind of mixed answer to that, which is I am in favor of imposing an age of consent and restrictions on these surgeries until an age of consent. I'm not sure exactly what that age of consent should be. I think that might differ society by society. So if we look at where adulthood starts, like in different societies around the world, I think based on our societal structures and the way that we grow up, like there is different levels of brain development by a certain age versus another age, and at what point we're able to make certain decisions. So like I wouldn't want to make like a blanket decision for around the world, but I do think the way that we as an intersex movement are fighting right now is state by state, to impose legislation that would not ban, as we say, not ban, simply delay these surgeries until an age of consent, when there is literally no medical reason not to delay them. I mean, thinking about the chance of cancer or any of those things, like all of that has been accounted for in this legislation that has been written. And so that would be my first piece. Is yes, I do believe there should be legislation delaying these procedures. That being said, I don't think that's going to solve the problem. I think even when things are made illegal, like people find a way to do them. I think there are parents who really, I think it'll help a lot, but I do think that there are parents that if this is, you know, these surgeries are delayed or criminalized until a certain age of consent, then I would imagine there might be certain extremely zealous parents who will find a surgeon who will do it anyway outside of the structures of the law. I mean, we've seen that with other procedures such as abortions, that making abortions illegal didn't make them stop, it just made them less safe. But honestly, I mean, so we'll have to see what that looks like. But I can't really see the same number of parents like taking an axe to their kids' genitals or something as I could to like a desperate woman eating a pill or using a coat hanger or something to give herself an abortion. I just feel like in general, besides, I mean, there's definitely child abuse that happens in a variety of contexts, but I would imagine that the instance of that sort of intervention by a parent on their child in the case of like, should legislation be passed, I would imagine that would be far less. I can't say for certain, but so I do think that in addition to legislation to delay surgeries, that the main thing that we have to do is just raise visibility for intersex conditions and normalize being intersex, and just help people understand that it's our identity and it's something that we're proud of and that we're not ashamed to be intersex. And the more parents, like I have parents reaching out to me all the time on Instagram or on the internet or whatever, and asking me like what to do with their kids, or telling me that, you know, having seen me and other people like me had led them to make certain decisions or not make certain decisions for their kids. And that's the whole point of us being visible, is trying to reduce the societal stigma and shame that that has silenced us for so long. So I think that's the more important piece, but I think the legislative piece is also really important.
I got a really interesting and sort of sophisticated question here from a student. It has to do with the relationship, the sort of, I guess, symmetry or asymmetry between between the operations on intersex babies we've been discussing, and then medical treatments for gender dysphoria.
Yeah.
Gender dysphoria being, for those who don't know, gender dysphoria, as I understand it, is when someone is transgender, they identify with a gender that they feel is different from their biological sex. And then the dysphoria part is this can cause a really extreme anxiety and stress and so forth. So that's a sometimes a condition that needs to be managed in therapy and sometimes hormone treatments and other things. Okay, but so the student's question, very interesting. So there are people who are against medical interventions for transgender children, the most controversial one being puberty blockers, right? So so for those listening who haven't been following this issue, and not that I'm an expert, you might know more about it than me, but the concern is that if children with gender dysphoria who are made unhappy by their anatomy, right? They feel like they want the anatomy associated with the other sex. Puberty is an especially stressful time because their anatomy sort of
is changing,
develops in a more, so puberty blockers,
the direction that they don't want it to. Yeah.
Right. So puberty blockers are like a hormonal treatment that that delays that process, that stressful, difficult process for those children. So the question is, the sort of normalizing heteronormative and sort of binary sex, binary gender type of view, these kind of conventional views of these things we've been discussing seem like they're kind of going in opposite directions in the two cases. Okay, where they're promoting medical intervention. They're promoting medical intervention in the case of intersex babies, opposing medical hormonal intervention in the case of transgender children. So I don't know. Yeah, you can, I guess, go with that as you'd like.
It's totally nonsensical from like a logical standpoint. There's a lot of illogical legislation and work done in this country, but yeah, I mean, and that to me, that simple fact proves that it is just all rooted in this societal stigma and just othering of people. And so it's like in the case of transgender kids, they are deemed other, and so we should not allow them to intervene and choose their own interventions, because we need to stigmatize and marginalize the other. And then with intersex kids, we are deemed other, and so we should enact those same surgeries, hormone replacement therapies that we're denying to trans kids without intersex kids' consent on their body, because we need to prevent the other quell the other, squash the other, and fit people into what we deem to be normal. So the motivation is the same, which is just to keep people normal as the way that society deems it, or certain societies and religious views deem it. But in that same, with that same motivation, then two completely logically contradicting solutions are proposed, and each of them directly counter the other.
One thing, and so I want to ask sort of my own question here, or maybe just make a comment, and you can address it as you choose. One thing that was really interesting to me about your writing is that I realized as I was reading it, I didn't even realize there were intersex issues. Like, I've heard the term intersex, and in particular, I mean, intersex people are sort of brought up a lot these days to try to refute binary views of sex or of gender. So you hear these debates where somebody's arguing gender isn't binary or sex isn't binary, and then intersex gets brought up. But it's usually brought up in a debate about transgender issues. And then the issues that are actually discussed have to do with transgender people, which are important issues to discuss. But then as I was reading your stuff, I was like, oh, actually, although intersex people are brought up in those debates to make a kind of theoretical point about binaries or the lack thereof, intersex issues aren't really discussed at all, or I don't really see it.
Yeah, it's a really big problem. I think we hopefully will hit like a tipping point as the transgender movement did. Hopefully it'll be soon. There have been intersex advocates fighting for a long time. I think that part of the reason why it hasn't snowballed more quickly is because intersex interventions traditionally happen at so much of a younger age that these forces, medical forces, parental forces, are able to shame these kids into silence so early on that most of them never end up speaking out. Whereas transgender people, like, you don't know that they're trans when they're born, and so you can't intervene or not intervene. Like, essentially, trans people are only able to affirm their identity at an age where most intersex interventions have probably already happened for an intersex kid. And so I think because of that, like, a lot of trans issues become apparent later in life when people are more able to speak out. So that it was requiring people like me to speak out that have had these interventions done to us and who are brave enough to come forward and talk about why this isn't right. I also think that there are issues that within any community, once their own issues are solved, people tend to sit down and just not fight for other people's issues. Kind of looking at every letter of that LGBTQIA spectrum, like, once gay men got certain rights, a lot of them sat down, and once, so on and so forth, and going all the way down the alphabet soup. And then you have the piece that a lot of these intersex issues, one, we're fighting essentially the medical community, where the transgender community is essentially fighting, I would say maybe like evangelicals and people that come from like a certain religious viewpoint, whereas the intersex community is having to discredit these people that are seen as extremely educated and leaders in society that are doctors. And there are doctors who are supporting our views, but there are some very vocal medical associations that frankly, they profit off of surgeries as well. The way that our medical industrial complex works in this country is that there are doctors who make money off of these surgeries, and there are doctors that come informed by some of these evangelical viewpoints. But I think that's part of it too, is like, I think we need to look more to how the gay community was able to depathologize their own condition, human condition, and look to that because, you know, they used to fight it psychological normalizing and we're fighting surgical normalizing. But I think those three factors. So one, it's like we're having to discredit like super accredited people, medically accredited people. Two, we're normalized and shamed into science earlier on at a point when we're still so vulnerable that we tend to just stay there and never want to talk about or delve into these things. Like me going through after having coming out, it hasn't all been easy peasy lemon squeezy. Like I've had to do a lot of work with a therapist and it sucks to have to unpack all of this stuff that I tried to push aside my whole life and just not acknowledge. And so there's that piece. And then there's lastly the piece, which is like, frankly, we need other organizations and movements to stick up for us. Like if you're going to use us as the gotcha in your arguments, then you have to fight for us. You can't just say your bodies prove my point. You have to say, I'm going to use my body to stand up for your body. And I'm not seeing enough of that. And maybe that's part of the issues with some identity politics is people tend to feel like they're in their own lane and can only fight with issues that they personally have experienced or understood. But we need more people. And so a lot of the work that I do, there are intersex activists that do pure visibility work and they're out there on Instagram, they have 1 million followers or whatever. And then there's some that do more legislative work or some that do this. And what I see as my role is really as like a coalition builder across intersectionally related movements. So getting the sexual assault movement to understand, well, if you shouldn't touch my body without my consent, then you certainly shouldn't surgery my body without my consent. Or getting the reproductive rights movement to say, forced sterilization of intersex kids is a reproductive rights issue. We are making decisions about their ability when and whether to have children. Or getting the LGBTQIA, the queer community, to understand that not just the overlaps with trans people, but with the gay community, as I talked about with conversion therapy, there are so many intersections and overlaps there. So I think a lot of my work is coalition building between related movements so that hopefully when we're ready, at least here in Austin, to enact some larger societal changes, we have more people showing up besides just the few intersex people that have been brave enough to come out.
I think that brings us full circle to something I said I wanted to talk with you about at the beginning, which is what you're working on, how you got into it. And maybe I'll end with that question because I don't want to take up too much of your time. What are your current projects concretely? How did you get into it? How can those viewing this interview find you and find out more?
Well, I'm kind of an Insta-ho. I'm on Instagram a lot. So if you want to follow me, my Instagram handle is XOXY_Alicia, ALICIA. And I kind of just document my existence as a person in society. But I think, so one thing I'm involved in on behalf of an organization called Interact, just like the normal word interact, you can look up interactadvocates.org. I'm helping them with pushing a legislative agenda state by state to help delay these surgeries to an age of consent. My role in that movement is less on the ground and more the fact that I am super politically involved. So creating political relationships that'll then be beneficial to those policies being enacted. If you do follow me on Instagram, you'll see I've made videos with Beto O'Rourke and Cory Booker and Wendy Davis and all of these well-known progressive candidates who share our ideas about human rights and body autonomy, so that I can hold them accountable for when we're ready to pass legislation or activities through their respective branches of government, that I can count on their support and finding legislative champions for that. Tomorrow I'm being appointed to our Human Rights Commission here in Austin, which creates like local policy to prevent discrimination. So once I'm in that position of relative power, I'm going to have a lot more leverage to enact at least local policies that'll hopefully be able to determine some of the actions of our local hospital systems and clinics. I do a lot of clinic education for all different sorts of clinics about how they can be more affirming of intersex people. And for the visibility piece for me, again, I'm not like one of those people that's going to be like Insta famous or something, but for me, I'm going more through the political system itself, and creating relationships so that hopefully, in a little bit, I might end up running for something, and then just having that ability for to raise visibility as an intersex candidate would be huge. And then having gotten involved in related political work, just being at the legislature and fighting for other people, just killing a bill that would have targeted me recently, means that all of a sudden all these new legislators are just aware of the issues that we're facing in that context. So I would say like my specific work, and this is all like, I also have a full-time job that's not related. So I mean, we could talk about that, but that's boring. But yeah, just as an activist, I'm trying to do as much as I can, but also figuring out what my lane is. And I think that my particular lane is being politically involved, coalition building, and kind of educating policymakers and becoming a policymaker that can enact some of these changes.
I've got to ask one more thing about the politics, real quick. Have you have you been very successful in, you mentioned some Democratic politicians you've reached out to. Have you tried or had any success with Republican or independent politicians? I ask because, and this comes back to the progressive issue that I mentioned at the start. You describe yourself as a progressive activist and an intersex activist. A lot of what you're describing to me, a lot of the concerns you have to me, excuse me?
Could be like libertarian as well.
Libertarian, even I think conservative in some sense of the original meaning of that term. And so some issues like this that don't need to belong to one side of the aisle, once they get politicized, then they're stuck on that side of the aisle, right? Climate change might be like that.
There's a risk of that. I think one point that I have to refute that is in this most recent piece of legislation that I wanted to kill, that one of the issues is frankly that just the Republican Party has become a Christian values party. And I think in general, Christianity, or at least evangelical Christians, certainly not all Christians, but evangelical Christians have been pushing a lot of Republican-led legislation for Christian family values. And so one of these bills that would have targeted me like writes into legislation that marriage is between a man and a woman, and that man and woman are binary and immutable and unchangeable, which physical evidence is not true. And so while I would like to think that they would be appealing to both sides of the aisle, and I totally hear your point, which is like once one side picks something up, then the other side wants nothing to do with it and can't do anything with it. And there's certainly that risk of it. But right now I see so much, frankly, conservative legislation driven by evangelical Christian beliefs that is targeting me unintentionally, intending to target the trans community, intending to target the gay community, and then unintentionally targeting me as well, which is what my New York Times article was about too. It's like, we always forget when you're trying to kill the trans people, you're also hurting the intersex people. But so that's the piece why I tend to work more on the progressive side of the aisle with these things, because unfortunately, you're right. I think as far as political values in the traditional sense of how the parties were, I could see conservatives or libertarians especially getting behind some of our autonomy issues. But the way that the party has been co-opted by certain values that are not actually political and a lot more very nuanced religious values, then that becomes more of a separation of church and state issue, which if you do, any of you follow me on Instagram or watch me on Twitter, like going into the legislature, oftentimes we have to speak, when we're speaking to a bunch of Republican legislators, we have to speak in terms of God, and I have to refer to myself as God's children or talk about these things because that is the language that they speak in when they're talking about the laws that they're writing for us. And so I would argue that until there's better separation between church and state, specifically within the Conservative Party, then I'm going to stick on my progressive side of the aisle.
Well, thanks so much. That was a lot of fun. I really appreciate you taking the time.
Thank you. Thank you for everyone's interest. And feel free, Professor Surovell has my email, so feel free to reach out.
Thanks, Alicia.
Thanks. See you later.